The clatter of the kitchen stopped the second I said it. My future father-in-law had been standing at the counter with his back to me, carving the prime rib he'd been bragging about all afternoon, and he froze mid-cut, the knife hovering over the meat. He'd just finished telling me, in that slow, patient voice men use when they think you're a little slow, that hospitals these days hire administrators who've never seen a sick day in their lives, and that's why everything's fallen apart. I set my wineglass down and said, "I'm the one who runs the hospital. I'm the new chief of medicine at St. Aldrich. I start Monday." He turned around very slowly. The carving knife was still in his hand, and for the first time in the 4 hours I'd known him, he didn't have a single word ready. But to understand how a man like Harold Whitcomb ended up standing in his own kitchen, speechless, with a knife dripping juice onto his good shoes, you have to go back about 3 weeks, to the night his son told me his parents wanted to meet me. I'd just signed the offer letter. My name was going on a door I'd spent 14 years walking past, first as a resident who got yelled at in the hallways, then as an attending, then as a department head, and now as the youngest chief of medicine St. Aldrich had ever appointed. I was 33. The hospital sat on the north side of Columbus, a big teaching institution with a trauma center that never slept. And I'd been told by 3 different people on the board that my age was going to be a problem for some folks. I'd told them I'd been hearing that since medical school, and I'd stopped flinching at it somewhere around year 5. Theo found me at the kitchen table that night, still in my scrubs, the offer letter face up between my coffee mug and a stack of unopened mail. He kissed the top of my head and read it over my shoulder, and then he sat down across from me with that look he gets when he's working up to something. "My parents want to have us over for dinner," he said. "Sunday." That sounds nice. I meant it. We'd been together 2 years and engaged for 4 months, and I'd only met his folks once, briefly, at a cousin's wedding where there'd been too many people and not enough time. I'd like that. He nodded, but he was turning his coffee mug in a slow circle on the table, which is what he does when he's not telling me something. "There's a thing," he said. "There's always a thing when you say it like that." He laughed, but it didn't reach all the way. "My dad, he's a particular kind of guy. Particular how?" Theo rubbed the back of his neck. "He was a cardiothoracic surgeon for 31 years. Big reputation. The kind of guy who walked into an OR and everybody got quiet. He retired 4 years ago, and I don't think he's forgiven the world for letting him." I'd heard a little of this. Theo didn't talk about his father much, and now I understood it wasn't because there was nothing to say. "He has opinions about medicine," Theo went on, "about where it's headed. He thinks it's gone soft. Too many committees, too many administrators, not enough people who've actually had a patient die on the table at 2 in the morning. "That's not a rare opinion among surgeons his age," I said. "Yeah." Theo finally looked at me. "And he's got opinions about women in leadership too. He'd never say anything cruel, not on purpose. He came up in a world where the chief was always a guy who looked like him, and I don't think it's ever once occurred to him that the world moved on without asking permission." I let that sit for a second. 33 years old and a woman in a field where the grey hair in the room still gets the benefit of the doubt. None of this was new to me. I'd been underestimated by better men than I'd yet met. "Does he know what I do?" I asked. And Theo did the thing. He looked down at his coffee. "Theo, I might have told him you work in hospital administration." I stared at him. "I'm a doctor." "I know. You told your father I'm an administrator. Like I file insurance paperwork." I panicked, he said, and at least he had the decency to look miserable about it. "The first time he asked, it was right after that wedding, and you weren't even there, and he was already going off about how the hospitals near them keep hiring these MBA types who've never touched a patient, and I didn't want the first thing he knew about you to be a fight. So I was vague. And then being vague became a lie, and the lie just sat there. For 4 months." "For 4 months," he admitted. I should have been angrier than I was. I think the only reason I wasn't is that I understood it. I'd spent my whole career deciding when to lead with the title and when to leave it in my pocket, and there's a strange relief in being met as just a person before you become a rank. Theo had robbed me of the choice, but I understood the impulse underneath it. "So what happens Sunday?" I asked. He winced. "I figured maybe we'd just get through the dinner. Let him meet you as you. And then we tell him. You want me to sit through a dinner where your father thinks I'm a paper pusher and possibly explains my own profession to me?" "When you say it like that, it sounds bad." "It is bad, Theo. I know." He reached across the table and took my hand. "I'm sorry. I'll tell him beforehand if you want. I'll call him right now." I thought about it. I briefed hospital boards. I told families things no one wants to hear at 3 in the morning. I'd held a 16-year-old's hand while a surgeon I trusted tried to bring her back and didn't. I could survive Sunday dinner with a retired surgeon who thought I balanced budgets. "No," I said, "let him meet me first. I'm curious what kind of man he is when he doesn't know he's supposed to be impressed." Theo squeezed my hand. "You're not what I deserve." "No," I agreed. "I'm not." We drove out to his parents' place that Sunday afternoon, 40 minutes north of the city, into the kind of suburb where the lawns are all the same length and the mailboxes match the houses. The Whitcombs lived at the end of a cul-de-sac in a brick colonial with white columns that were a little too grand for the lot, the kind of house that announces a man did well for himself and would like you to notice. There was a flag by the door and a wreath, even though it was September, and a gleaming German sedan in the driveway that Theo's mother apparently never drove. Theo turned off the engine and didn't move. "You're nervous," I said. "A little." "It's going to be fine. You don't know him yet." "Then I'm looking forward to learning." He cracked a smile at that, the first real one all afternoon, and we got out of the car. Harold Whitcomb opened the door before we reached it. He was a big man even in his late 60s, tall and squared off, with white hair combed back and the kind of posture that suggested he'd never once been told to sit up straight because he'd simply always done it. He shook Theo's hand first, a real grip, the kind that's a little bit of a test. And then he turned to me. "You must be Norah." "That's me. It's good to finally meet you, Mr. Whitcomb. Harold's fine." His handshake was firm and quick, and his eyes did a fast survey of me that I recognized because I do the same thing to patients walking through my door, reading, sorting, filing into a category before the conversation even starts. He'd filed me already. I could tell. Behind him, a woman appeared in the hall, smaller and softer, with kind, tired eyes and a dish towel over one shoulder. Theo's mother, Diane. She hugged her son and then took both my hands in hers. "Norah, we're so glad. Come in, come in. It's getting cold out there." The house smelled like rosemary and roasting meat. The entryway had a wall of framed photographs, and I clocked them the way you can't help clocking things. Harold in surgical scrubs receiving some kind of award. Harold shaking hands with a man who might have been a senator. A younger Harold, in a white coat outside a hospital with his name partially visible on the building's cornerstone behind him. A man who'd been important and who'd hung the proof of it where everyone coming through his door would see. We sat in a formal living room that nobody looked like they ever actually sat in, and Harold poured wine without asking what anyone wanted, and the question started before I'd finished my first sip. "Theo tells me you're over at St. Tin. Aldridge," he said, settling into a leather chair that was clearly his. "That's right. Good hospital. Used to be anyway. What is it you do there?" "Administration," I said, which wasn't a lie, exactly. Running a department is administration, running a hospital is mostly administration. I just let him hear what he wanted to hear. He nodded slowly, satisfied, the way you nod when someone confirms a thing you already believed. "Well, somebody's got to keep the lights on, I suppose." Diane brought out a tray of something with goat cheese, and we made small talk for a while. She asked where I'd grown up. "Toledo," I told her. "My dad was a high school chemistry teacher. My mom did the books for a trucking company. Harold perked up a little at the chemistry teacher, said he'd always thought teachers were underpaid, which was generous of him, and then he steered it back, the way he steered everything back, to medicine. "I'll tell you what's wrong with hospitals now," he said, swirling his wine. "Too many people in the building who've never made a decision that mattered. You've got administrators making calls about patient care who couldn't find the gallbladder if you handed them a map." "Dad," Theo said. "I'm not talking about Norah." He waved a hand at me, magnanimous. "She's on the business side, she knows what I mean. You see it, don't you? The MBAs running around with their spreadsheets, deciding how long a surgeon gets with a patient." "I've seen the spreadsheets," I said, which was true. "I made some of them." This pleased him enormously. He leaned forward, warming up, and I realized I was about to get the lecture Theo had warned me about, and that there was going to be a lot of it. We moved to the dining room around 6. Diane had set a real table, cloth napkins, the good plates, a centerpiece of late-season flowers. The prime rib came out crusted dark and beautiful, and there were roasted fingerling potatoes and green beans, almondine, and a dish of cream spinach that Diane apologized for twice before anyone had even tried it. It was a good meal. The Whitcombs ate like people who'd had money long enough to stop thinking about it, and Harold talked. He was, I'll give him this, a genuinely interesting talker when he wasn't lecturing. He told a story about a transplant case in the 80s, a kid who'd come in with hours to live, and the way he described the OR, the cold, the lights, the particular silence of a room where everyone knows the next 10 minutes decide everything, was vivid enough that even Theo, who'd surely heard it before, leaned in. The man had been a great surgeon. You could feel it. That was the thing about Harold Whitcomb that made him hard to simply dislike. The pride wasn't hollow. He'd earned it decades ago with his hands in rooms where it counted. The trouble was, he'd never figured out how to set it down. "The problem now," he said, somewhere into the prime rib, "is that nobody wants to put in the years. Everybody wants the corner office and the title, and they want it at 40, at 35. He pointed his fork vaguely. "When I was coming up, you didn't run anything until you bled for it. You earned your place by being the last one to leave and the first one back." "Things have changed a little, Harold," Diane said gently. "Have they gotten better?" He looked around the table like it was a real question. "I don't think they have. I think we promoted a lot of people who are very good at meetings." "Dad, can we maybe not do the whole speech tonight?" Theo said. "It's not a speech." Harold turned to me, and there it was, the thing I'd come for. "Norah understands. She works around real doctors. You see it from where you sit, don't you? These young department heads who've never had to make the hard call. They sit in their offices and they manage." I set down my fork and folded my hands in my lap. "What's a hard call in your mind?" I asked. Not sharp, just curious. He liked the question. He liked any question that gave him room. "I'll tell you. A hard call is when there's no good option. When you've got one bed in the ICU and 2 patients who need it, and a family screaming at you in the hallway, and you have to decide in 30 seconds who has the better chance, and then you have to live with it. That's not a thing you learn from a textbook or a committee. You learn it the hard way, or you don't learn it at all." The room was quiet. Diane was looking at her plate. Theo had gone still beside me. "And you don't think," Harold continued, gentler now, almost kind, which was somehow worse, "you don't think the people running these places now have ever had to do that. They've never sat with a death. They optimize, they don't decide." I thought about a Tuesday 11 months ago. A multi-car pileup on 71, the trauma bay full, 2 patients coding in adjacent rooms and 1 anesthesiologist between them. I thought about the 30 seconds I'd had. I thought about the family I talked to afterward, the mother who'd grabbed my coat and asked me why, and I'd had no answer that would ever be enough. "That sounds like a real burden," I said. "It is." Harold sat back, satisfied, mistaking my quiet for agreement. It's the kind of thing you can't explain to someone who hasn't lived it. No offense to your line of work. The hospital needs people like you, too. But it's a different world from the one where the decisions get made. Dad. Theo's voice had an edge now. Norah knows more about that world than you think. Harold raised an eyebrow, amused. Does she? She does. Well. He smiled at me not unkindly, the way you'd smile at a child who'd been told they were good at something. I'm sure you've picked things up. You're around it all day. But knowing about it and living it aren't the same, are they? And I'll be honest, I almost let it go. There's a version of that evening where I just nodded, where I let the man enjoy his roast and his certainty, where Theo and I told him the truth gently sometime later, by phone with a buffer of distance. I'd let worse slide. You learn to, in my work. You let a lot of things slide, so you can be sharp about the things that matter. But then Harold said one more thing, and it changed the temperature in my chest. You know what I worry about, he said, cutting another slice of beef, talking to the table now more than to me. I worry about my old hospital, St. Aldridge. They just brought in some new chief of medicine, and you want to know how old they tell me this person is? 30-something. 33. He shook his head. 33 years old, running a department that takes 33 years to understand. I don't know who's making these decisions anymore. He glanced at me, including me in the joke, probably an administrator. The kitchen was where it happened, in the end, because Diane asked him to carve the second roast and he got up to do it, still talking, and I followed with the empty bread basket because I needed to be standing for what I was about to say. That's when I said it, that I was the one who ran the hospital, that I was the new chief of medicine at St. Aldridge, that I started Monday. He turned around very slowly with the knife in his hand, and the kitchen went so quiet I could hear the refrigerator humming and the clock over the stove ticking, and from the dining room, Thea's chair scraping back as he stood. You're what? Harold said. It wasn't really a question. Dr. Norah Castellan, I said. I trained at Case Western, did my residency in internal medicine at the Cleveland Clinic, came to St. Aldridge 11 years ago. I've been chief of the Department of Medicine for the last 3 years. As of Monday morning, I'm chief of medicine for the whole institution. I'm 33. I let that part land. I'm the person you've been worried about. For a long moment, he just looked at me, and I watched a man who had spent his whole life being the smartest person in every room try to find the floor under his feet. That's not, he started and stopped. The surgeon in him was already going back over the evening. I could see it. The questions I'd asked. The way I'd answered about the hard call. The thing I'd said about sitting with a death, which he'd taken as sympathy and now understood as recognition. You can call the hospital Monday if you'd like to confirm it, I said. Ask for the new chief of medicine. They'll put you through to my office. Diane had come to the kitchen doorway. She had a hand over her mouth. Theo, Harold said, not taking his eyes off me. Did you know? Of course I knew, Dad. Thea's voice was tight. She's my fiancé. I told you she was in hospital administration because you spent the whole car ride to the wedding complaining about administrators, and I didn't want you to hate her before you met her. That's on me. But everything she just said is true. Harold set the knife down on the cutting board very carefully, the way you set down something you no longer trust your hands with. The new chief, he repeated, at St. Aldridge. Yes, the one I've been. He stopped. I watched the whole evening replay behind his eyes, every word of it, the spreadsheets and the gallbladder map, and the people who optimize instead of decide. And I watched him understand that he had spent 4 hours explaining medicine to one of the people running the hospital he'd built his name in. Oh, Harold, Diane said softly from the doorway. And there was something almost like a laugh in it. the kind you can't help when a thing is too large to hold any other way. He didn't get angry. I'll give him that, and it surprised me. A smaller man would have gotten loud, would have found a way to make it my fault for not announcing myself at the door. Harold just stood there in his kitchen, with the prime rib cooling on the cutting board and the color drained out of his face. And when he finally spoke, his voice had lost all of its weight. "You let me talk like that," he said. "All night. You sat there and let me explain your own job to you." "You weren't ready to hear it any other way," I said. "That's—" He shook his head. "Most people would have cut me off at the first sentence. I'm not most people. And you weren't trying to be cruel. You were defending something you love. I understand that better than you'd guess." He looked at me then like he was seeing me for the first time, which I suppose he was. The category he'd filed me into at the front door had just dissolved, and he was standing in the wreckage of it, trying to assemble a new one. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You don't owe me anything." "I do." He said it flatly, the way a surgeon states a finding. "I made up my mind about you before you'd taken your coat off. I talked down to a colleague in my own house. He stopped, and his jaw worked, and I realized the thing that was hitting him hardest wasn't that he'd been wrong about my resume. I told a chief of medicine that people like her have never sat with a deaf. "Some haven't," I said. "You weren't wrong about everything. You were just wrong about me." Dinner sort of ended after that. Diane plated the second roast and nobody ate much of it. Theo kept catching my eye across the table with an expression caught between mortification and something close to awe. Harold was quiet in a way I suspected was rare for him, turning his water glass in slow circles, and twice I caught him starting to say something and thinking better of it. It was Diane who finally cracked it open, while she was cutting a pie nobody had room for. "Well," she said, "this certainly explains why you were so patient with him." She looked at her husband with 30-some years of fondness and exasperation in one glance. "Harold, the woman runs a hospital and you try to teach her what a hard call is." "Diane, I'm just saying. I've been trying to get you to listen to people for 40 years, and it took a major general of medicine walking into my kitchen too." "She's not a general, she's a chief of medicine," Harold said, and then he caught himself. And for the first time all night something cracked in his face that was almost a smile. "Though I suppose the chain of command is similar." Theo laughed, a startled bark of relief. And even I had to smile. And the thing that had been sitting on the table all evening like a third roast finally lifted. Just a little. Harold called me 4 days later. My assistant put it through, and his name on the line gave me a small jolt. I hadn't expected to hear from him so soon. His voice was different on the phone, smaller without the dining room around it. "Dr. Castellan," he said. "Norah's fine, Harold." "I wonder," he said, and I could hear him choosing the words, "if you'd let me buy you a cup of coffee. There's a place near the hospital. I used to go there between cases. I'd like to talk to you, if you can spare half an hour, away from the family. I didn't say everything I wanted to say the other night. I had a meeting at 2, but I could move it. I can spare half an hour." The coffee shop was an old diner 2 blocks from St. Treat, Aldridge, the kind of place with vinyl booths and a pie case and waitresses who'd been there long enough to call a retired surgeon on. Harold was already in a booth when I got there, and he stood when he saw me, which I didn't expect and didn't entirely know what to do with. We ordered coffee. He wrapped both hands around the mug like he needed it for something other than drinking. "I want to say this right," he said. "I've been practicing it, which is ridiculous for a man my age." "Take your time." He took a breath. "I gave 40 years to that hospital. 31 in the OR and the rest fighting the people who wanted to change how it ran. And somewhere in there, I decided that the only people who understood it were the people who'd done it the way I did it. Which meant I stopped seeing anybody who came after me. I looked right past a whole generation of doctors because they didn't look like the ones I trained with." He turned the mug. And then one of them turned out to be sitting at my dinner table, marrying my son, running my hospital, and I'd already made up my mind she was a clerk. It's a common mistake, I said. It's not a mistake I'd have tolerated from a resident. I didn't argue with that because he was right. Can I ask you something? He said. The other night, when I went on about the hard call, the 1 bed, 2 patients, he looked up at me. You'd done it. I could see it after. You'd done it and you let me explain it to you like a textbook. 11 months ago, I said, a pile-up on the interstate. 2 patients coding, 1 of me. I made the call in less time than it's taking me to tell you about it. The other patient's mother grabbed my coat in the hallway afterward and asked me why, and I didn't have an answer for her. I still don't. Harold was quiet for a moment. You carry that one. I carry all of them. You did too. That's the part you got right. He nodded slowly and his eyes were wet, and he looked away out the window so I wouldn't have to watch it. I spent so many years afraid the place would fall apart when men like me left it, he said, and it turns out it's in better hands than mine. That's a hell of a thing to be relieved about and grieve at the same time. The work you did is the floor I'm standing on, I told him, and I meant it. It didn't fall apart. It grew up. That's not the same as falling apart. He looked back at me. Theo found himself a good one. Theo lied to you about my job for 4 months. Theo, Harold said, is an idiot, and I love him, and he was probably right to do it, which is the most annoying part. He almost smiled again. If I'd known what you were before I met you, I'd have spent the whole dinner performing for you instead of showing you exactly who I am. At least this way you got the honest version. God help you. I laughed. The honest version's not so bad. It just needs to listen a little more. It's 68 years old, Harold said. It's a slow learner, but it's not done learning. He set down his coffee. I'd like you to come back to the house. Diane's already planning it. Same meal, she insists, says we're going to do it over and do it right. And I promise not to explain medicine to the chief of medicine. You can explain it, I said. Just expect me to push back now. I'm counting on it. We went back 2 Sundays later. Same brick colonial, same flag, same German sedan that Diane never drove. But Harold opened the door before we reached it and shook my hand like he meant it, both of his around mine, and called me Dr. Castellan in front of his wife with something that was almost pride. The same prime rib came out of the same oven, and this time, when the talk turned to medicine, because it always does with people like us, he asked instead of told. He wanted to know about the residents. He wanted to know if they still had it. The thing he was afraid had been lost. I told him they did. Different, but they did. He listened the way I imagine he'd once listened in an OR, fully, the way you listen when something matters. Near the end of the night, when Theo had stepped out to take a call and Diane was running the dishwasher, Harold and I ended up alone at the table. Can I tell you the part that stayed with me? He said. Go ahead. It's not that you outranked everything I ever was. I made my peace with that on the drive home, more or less. He turned his glass. It's that you let me be wrong all night and never once made me small for it. You could have. I'd have deserved it. And you just let me find my own way to the bottom of it. He looked at me. Where'd you learn that? I thought about it. From the patients, mostly. You can't bully a frightened person into trusting you. You have to give them room to come to it. Turns out it works on retired surgeons, too. He laughed, a real one, the kind that comes up from somewhere old. I thought I knew what I'd do if anyone ever humiliated me like that. Turns out nobody humiliated me. I did that to myself, and you just stood there and let me keep my dignity while I cleaned it up. He shook his head. That's a harder thing to do than getting even. I'd never have managed it. It's not getting even, I said. It's just the only version of the night that left us both able to come back to this table. Diane stuck her head in from the kitchen. Are you two reorganizing American medicine in here? Just the small stuff, Harold said. Later, driving home with Theo's hand resting on my knee and the suburbs sliding back into city behind us, I thought about how I'd gone into that first dinner braced for a fight and walked out of the second one with a father-in-law I'd somehow gained instead of survived. People think the strongest thing you can do to someone who underestimates you is prove them wrong as loudly as possible. Make them feel it, make them remember it. And I understand the appeal. I've wanted it. Plenty of I've wanted it, plenty of times in plenty of hallways. But I've spent my whole life in rooms where the loudest person is rarely the one in charge, and I've learned that the deepest kind of authority doesn't announce itself. It waits. It lets a proud man talk himself all the way to the edge of his own certainty, and then it offers him a hand back instead of a shove. He'll remember the hand longer than he'd have remembered the fall. And the strange thing, the thing I didn't expect, is that you walk away from it lighter too. Not because you won, because nobody had to lose. The thing I keep coming back to is the moment Harold set that carving knife down on the cutting board, slow and careful, like his own hands had become something he couldn't fully trust anymore. He didn't yell. He didn't reach for an excuse. A different man would have made the whole night my fault for not announcing my title at the door, and I've met plenty of those men in hospital hallways. But Harold did the harder thing. He stood in the wreckage of what he'd assumed about me and started, right there, to rebuild it honestly. None of what happened that evening was an accident. Harold spent 4 decades being the smartest, loudest, most certain person in every room, and certainty like that doesn't soften on its own. It has to get caught. He talked himself all the way to the edge of his own arrogance because nobody ever stopped him before, and the lecture he gave me was simply the sum of every time someone had nodded along instead of pushing back. The cause built the effect. And the reason the night ended at a kitchen table instead of in a slammed door is that I made a choice not to humiliate a proud man who was wrong, but to let him find the bottom of it himself and offer him a hand back up. That choice didn't come from nowhere either. I learned it the slow way, in rooms where frightened patients decided whether to trust me, where I figured out you can't bully anyone into respect. You earn it by staying steady when staying steady is the hardest thing. The discipline to sit through that whole dinner without snapping, to absorb the insult and answer the man's real question instead of his insulting tone, took everything I had. It would have felt so good to cut him off at the first sentence. The strength was in not doing it, and underneath all of it was a kind of fairness I tried to carry into every difficult room. Harold wasn't cruel. He was defending something he'd given his life to, and grieving a world that moved on without asking his permission. Seeing that clearly, not excusing it but understanding it, is its own quiet form of wisdom, the kind that turns an enemy across a table into a father-in-law beside you at it. So if you take anything from Norah and Harold and that cooling prime rib, take this. The loudest revenge is rarely the one that changes anybody. Build the steadiness to stay calm when you're underestimated, the clear sight to understand why someone misjudged you, and the decency to let them keep their dignity while they correct themselves. Do those 3 things, and you'll find the same thing I did, driving home that night feeling lighter than I had any right to. You don't have to win. You just have to leave the table in a way that lets everyone come back to it.